Let's come back to the potential beginning and ending dates for the 1260 years as it relates to the church. One of the views that I brought up last Wednesday night, and I'm not going to go into this in detail for that reason, is the view that the woman going to the wilderness is the church that went from Europe, a civilized world, so to speak, into the wilderness of the United States. If that were true, then the starting point for the 1260 days would have to be in the 1500s or 1600s AD. It was 1565 when the French Huguenots established a small colony on the St. Johns River in Florida, and it was 1620 when the Pilgrims settled Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, and 1629 when the Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But if any of those dates were the time when the woman went in the wilderness, that the woman was the church in Europe that went to what was a wilderness type of area that was in the United States, that would mean the 1260 years wouldn't end until the 27 or 2800s AD, and I cannot justify that kind of an extension of time. Another option that I mentioned previously is that the woman going to the wilderness is referring to the church going into the spiritual wilderness beginning around 90 to 100 AD when the last of the apostles died. That's when most believe John died and that he was the last of the apostles to die. If that's true, that would have to mean that the 1260 days ended somewhere around the 1350s to 60s. But that is highly unlikely because the church was worse at that time than it was right after the last of the apostles died, which means they certainly weren't coming out of the wilderness in that period. They were in some ways going deeper into the wilderness than what you might argue was happening in the days after the apostles. So I would rule that out. It's part of why I wanted to slow this down with you, brethren, unlike the kind of rapid-fire way I went through a few of these the last Wednesday night, because it gives me time to develop them where I'm not looking at a clock, so to speak. And if it's too much information, you just listen to as much as you can listen to. You study it, you look it up yourself, you validate and vet everything I'm saying. When it comes to what I'm going to say about 538 to 1798, I want you to validate and vet what I'm saying because I don't agree with those dates as the 1260 years, and some feel pretty strongly about them. So if my argument against that being the case, which I'll get to in just a little bit, is accurate, and the statements I'm saying historically are accurate, you should be able to investigate and find that out to be true. What you have to be very careful with is the sources you go to, though, because there are sources that have taught that, like a lot of the Seventh-day Adventist sites and books that have a very skewed conception of history, that no other historian would agree with some of the ideas of what they think was happening at those times, because they're trying to force events into a certain frame to make their prophetic prediction come about. But we will come back to that. I want to cover some of the times in the 300s to 400s AD, the 500s AD, which would get to their argument about 538, and see if we can see any time in the 300s or 400s AD that this 1260 years might have begun. Because remember, the idea is that the 1260 years is associated with the church going to the wilderness. So if we believe the church went in the wilderness when the church fell away, then whatever date we think is closest to when the church fell away would probably be when we think the church went in the wilderness. And there's times when I've talked about this period that I've said it that way, and I want to apologize for that because it's not my intent to communicate that the woman going to the wilderness has to be at the exact same time as the church falling away, because there's two different things actually going on. The Babylonish church fell away, so the question really would be, were there people there after the Babylonish church fell away who were continuing to try to resist that, who at some point went into the wilderness? That's a perfect example of something that I want you ministerial brethren to really study on your own, because that would mean that whatever time the church fell away might have been before the woman went in the wilderness. So the church fell away, and now we have a Babylonish church, and whoever this woman represents, which I believe to be the true people of God, by the way, may have still been in that church and came out of that church at some point that was a little later in time, and so the date of the beginning of the falling away may not coincide perfectly with the date of the beginning of the 1260 years. This is exactly why I want you to stop me, as I say with any of our local folks. Please stop me if you have a question or anything. This kind of format, I'm usually talking so fast, it might be hard to jump in, but if nothing else, send me a message of some kind so I can slow down. But if you can't feel like you can jump in without breaking the flow, so to speak, then send me a message and I will be happy to go into this in more detail. That's why it's valuable to talk about this with some of you who have studied some of these things in great depth already, because I know you're hungry for some of these deeper thoughts and want to know some of this history because you're asking me to get into this. That may not always be true of the general membership of the assembly on any given service that we might have. Everybody may not have that same interest level, or even perhaps the level of study or maybe even discipline of study that might be necessary if you're going to get this deep into a subject. So, talking about some of the events that happened in the 300s AD. Remember, I said, if we're going to conclude that the 1260 days is 1260 years, and we are going to have to find a proper beginning point for it and a proper end point. And given the significance of what it represents, the church going in and coming out, you'd have to have a beginning point and end point that is parallel with those events, that you would say, this is the kind of thing that would be associated with the church going into the wilderness. And then when you get to the end, this is the kind of thing that would be associated with the church coming out of the wilderness. I said I'd tell you when there are some legitimate possibilities, determining on what you think has to have happened during that 1260 years and what would have to complete it. In the 300s AD, we have the Edict of Milan around 312 to 313 when Christianity and other religions were formally recognized and they were no longer being persecuted. That would take you up into the 1570s if you went 1260 days from that period. I'm not going to go into all the historical events that might have happened in each of these years, but I personally don't see anything in 1572 or around that time, if you're calculating 1260 years from the time of the Edict of Milan, that would be significant enough to say it was the church coming out of the wilderness. So the next major date in the 300s is 325, the Council of Nicaea. That was a major step forward towards the church falling away. I personally think that was the beginning of the church beginning its true slide of falling away. Did it completely fall away at the Council of Nicaea in 325? I don't think I'd make that case, because some of the things that occurred at that council that we are so opposed to were reversed a few years later and battled over for several decades until finally we get to the next council of Constantinople in 381 AD, where they were ratified to the degree where if you did not agree with them, the empire would persecute you. If you went from the Council of Nicaea, 325, that'd take you out to 1585 AD. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurred in that year. It was a massacre of the Huguenots. And interestingly enough, that's the year that Martin Luther published his writing called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which is very much on the subject we're talking about. So I do not think any of those things are significant enough to say it would represent the ending of the 1260 days. And remember, this isn't a general period. It doesn't say about 1,000 years or even 1,000 years where you could say, well, he means close to 1,000. It may be a few years off. No, it's very specific. So you need to be very close to 1,260 years, if not dead on 1,260 years for your beginning and completion. And again, when we're talking about the Council of Nicaea, I said a moment ago that to me is one of the beginning points of the church sliding into darkness. It's when the church began to adulterate itself with the state and began to follow in the footsteps of their order and other things and begin to establish doctrines that were going to be more universal, that were absolutely pagan in origin. But that doesn't necessarily mean that'd be the beginning of the church going to the wilderness. If the ones going to the wilderness were persecuted for a time by the church that fell away, which does appear to be what's being described in Revelation 12. So let me repeat something I said just a few minutes ago because it's so important. The woman going to the wilderness in Revelation 12 is not the church falling away. Sometimes, as I've said it in a way that makes it sound like they're the same thing, and I've heard others as well, but that is not the case. The woman going to the wilderness is the true people of God going into the wilderness. And that's after they're persecuted by what appears to be the false church. So there has to be a false church first before the woman goes into the wilderness. And the false church has to persecute the woman for some period of time before the woman goes into the wilderness. It's sometime from the point of Jesus as the first man-child, so to speak, of that man-child group that we talked about in an earlier session, being caught away. And then after apostasy entered the church, which, by the way, didn't happen in the 100s or 200s AD, false ideas were entering, but true apostasy did not begin to be established as part and parcel, part of its DNA, so to speak, until you start getting into the 300s and 400s AD. And true persecution of other people in the church by a monolithic, systemic type of operation by a church, the Roman church, did not begin to happen until sometime after that. So if we're looking for persecution to occur and there to be some kind of spiritual warfare going on, you'd have to start with when the false church really came into being. And then the false church would have to persecute the true church, the true people of God. And then the true people of God would have to go into the wilderness. I hope those of you who are studious are following my point. And that's very simple. We often look for beginning points for the 1260 days of things that have to do with the church falling away. Like, when did the false church truly fall away? Or when did the false church, and here's what the Adventists did with 538, which is just their opinion and not very accurate, which I'll show you in a little bit. When did the false church truly gain power? It's not the false church gaining power that starts at 1260 days. The 1260 days isn't about the false church. It's about the true church. It's about when the false church persecuted the true church and the true church went into the wilderness. So it would have to be after the false church came to that level of power. The false church didn't truly and more systematically persecute what we believe to be the true people of God until after they rose that level of power, not at the moment that they did. I hope you're following me on these last points because they are very significant for why I believe the 1260 years did not start until a little later. I don't personally believe it started till at least the 600s to 800s AD, and I'm going to show you why that is as we go further on. Though again, if you're trying to argue that it started with the falling away, you might argue that that ended sometime in the period of the Reformation, but you notice that the key dates in what we might call the beginning of the falling away of the church, like the Council of Nicaea I've been discussing, the Council of Constantinople I reference, which, as I said, was in 381 AD. That's where what was began in Nicaea was codified in a much more rigid form, in a much more specific form. And if that were the date, by the way, then that would have had to end in 1641 AD. And once again, there's not anything that occurred in 1641 AD that you could possibly say would be the conclusion of the 1260 years. Which, if my theory is correct, that the 1260 years starts after the true church has been persecuted for a time by the false church, you shouldn't expect to see the beginning point in the 300s or the 400s, and probably not even in the 500s, because the true levels of persecution occurred later in time. And the highest levels of power that allowed that persecution occurred later than that. Time period associated with the Council of Constantinople actually covers a little bit more than just 381. There were some things that went on right before the council in 381, like the Edict of Thessalonica, which I'll come back to in a moment. And some scholars debate whether that council happened in 381 or 383. So if someone trying to theorize that the 1260 years starts with that period, they could have an endpoint anywhere from 1640 if you're talking about the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, or 1641 if you're talking about the Council of Constantinople in 381, or it could be 1643 if the council actually occurred in 383. If that were true, then the ending point of those dates would occur during the later part of the Reformation. But let me just touch on what happened in 380 and 381 in a little bit more detail and give you some other historical background that might be helpful as well. On February 27th of 380 AD is when the Edict of Thessalonica was made. That was made by Theodosius I, who was the emperor in the east, with co-emperors Gratian, the emperor in the west, and Valentinian II. The point of this edict was to compel all Roman citizens. They said it was their wish, but it was a little bit more than that. It was a compulsion. It was mandatory that all Roman citizens convert to Trinitarian Christianity. So even though that wouldn't be formalized in terms of a council till the next year, till 381, or potentially even to 383 if that date's right, this is when the edict was made that they expected Roman citizens to not just convert to Christianity, but to convert to a Trinitarian form of Christianity. And they said that they wanted them to do this so they would be in accord with the bishops that were in Rome and Alexandria. There's a reason they were specific about that, because at that time, the Patriarch of Constantinople was an Arian, and they were trying to reject him as being heretical. So they declared that if you're going to be in harmony with their church, and this is the Roman emperor making this statement, by the way, not one of the bishops, you would have to accept the Trinitarian form of Christianity. So that date is pretty significant. The next year that I mentioned already is when the First Council of Constantinople occurred. And I said some authorities date that to 383 instead of 381. I want to give you a little bit more detail on that than I did earlier. Theodosius I, a Roman emperor, not one of the ministers of the church, a civil leader, called the council just like Constantine, also a civil leader, who I seriously doubt was any kind of true Christian at the time, called the Council of Nicaea, almost 60 years before this. When the church began to allow civil leaders, especially men that it was very questionable about whether they're even Christian at all, as in the case of Constantine, to call their councils, It's very clear they had accepted a level of interaction with the state that adulterated that church. By the way, Constantine wasn't baptized as a Christian until his deathbed in the 330s AD. So when he called that council, he hadn't even been baptized as a Christian, and his authority was accepted with those bishops in that kind of a way, which is a serious problem that shows you that the church was undoubtedly falling away. Later in 381 or 383, when the Council of Constantinople occurred, and with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, the authority was being exercised by a Roman emperor once again, Theodosius. And by the way, some records say that Theodosius wasn't even baptized until the same time period in which they made this edict and council. So what does that say about his condition? This is a bit of a side point on our subject, but it's astonishing to me how easily later Christian historians, and now the vast majority of modern Christians, accept the results of those councils, when those councils were called by civil leaders, not religious leaders, who were either extremely new believers or who were not really believers at all until later in their lives. Why would you think that a council called under those conditions, made up of religious leaders, by the way, who would have had to have compromised from anything the apostles would have ever done in order to sit in those councils, would be the historical points you would want to look back to for the formation of your doctrinal faith, which most of modern Christians do? Coming back to this historical period, though, Theodosius, when he called this council in 381 or 383, did it to affirm the Nicene Creed that had come out of the Council of Nicaea and to denounce certain heresies, the main one of which was Arianism, the idea that there are two in the Godhead. What was done at the Council of Constantinople, it's usually called the First Council of Constantinople because it wasn't the last, not only settled that doctrinal issue, which was full of pagan ideas, but legal statements were made regarding the fact that you would be punished or persecuted if you dared to challenge that doctrine that had been established. By the way, the very first person who most people would refer to historically as a person who was a Christian who was persecuted by a so-called Christian church occurred right after this council. For one of the most neutral sources on this, I'll just quote what Wikipedia has to say in its article on heresy. It says the first known usage of the term heresy in a legal context was in AD 380 by the Edict of Thessalonica of Theodosius I, which made Christianity the state church of the Roman Empire. Prior to the issuance of this edict, the church had no state-sponsored support for any particular legal mechanism to counter what it perceived as heresy. In other words, believing something that is different than what the majority are teaching. By this edict, the state's authority and that of the Catholic Church became somewhat overlapping. That's the adulteration I'm talking about. One of the outcomes of this blurring of church and state was the sharing of state powers of legal enforcement with church authorities. This reinforcement of the church's authority gave church leaders the power to, in effect, pronounce the death sentence upon those whom the church considered heretical. Let me pause for a moment and expand on that. That means that any Arian, any person who believed there were two in the Godhead, could be killed for that belief because the majority rule at that time was that there are three in the Godhead. And if you didn't agree with that majority rule, your life could be taken. Do you think that would be a pretty effective way to wipe out anybody that believes a view other than a Trinitarian view, or at the very least, cause people who believed a different view to keep their mouth shut and not to be teaching that? It's like the concept in the West that we've had at times of a cancel culture. They literally were canceling the possibility of anybody standing up to teach against their paganized idea of God and Christ because they threatened you with death if you dared to question it. And if you know history pretty well, you'll know that all through the 300s, they were fighting back and forth over whether there were two or three. But after this council and after the threat of death coming from the Roman emperor, if you didn't agree with his view, which was the Trinitarian view, you don't see the same kind of resistance. So it worked to establish a Trinitarian view of the Godhead at the point of the sword, not by intellectual debate and certainly not by spiritual anointing. Let me go on with the last sentence of this article in Wikipedia. It says, within 5 years of the official criminalization of heresy by the emperor, the first Christian heretic to be prosecuted, Bishop Priscillian, was executed in 385 by Roman officials. Ambrose of Milan and Pope Siricius did excommunicate the people who accused that bishop of heresy. But that was the first example that you can see of Roman officials, civil officials, executing somebody on behalf of the church. That's essentially what they were doing. They were saying, if you don't believe what the Roman so-called Christian church believes, you will be executed. So this helps us to see when the real persecution began to occur, the so-called church, or at least those who are acting on behalf of the church, persecuting believers. There is another interesting thing that those of you that enjoy history will probably appreciate that happened during this period. This is the time when the emperors of Rome stopped using the title Pontifex Maximus. That's basically a title that means the highest or greatest priest. They stopped using that title for themselves, mainly because the Roman emperors at this time were all supposedly Christians, and that title had been used for Roman emperors in the past as being the head or the highest priest of all religions, and it was especially related to being the highest priest of the pagan priest of the pagan religions. So they wanted to get away from that title. During Gratian's reign, who was the emperor in the west, when Theodosius I was in the east, or maybe immediately after his reign, is when this title Pontifex Maximus stopped being used by the Roman emperors. They replaced it with the title Pontifex Incletus, which is a little bit toned-down version of it. It's not the exact same title, since they knew that title was associated with pagan priests, but it's somewhat similar. Incletus just basically refers to someone who's famous or renowned. So it'd be like, instead of saying the highest or greatest priest, it's a renowned or famous priest. So the Roman emperors still used the title for priests in some sense, but they wanted to intentionally get away from the title Pontifex Maximus because that title was very clearly associated with pagan priesthood. Theodosius followed Gratian's example in this, and it appears that no Roman emperors formally used that title from that point on. I think it's interesting that this all happened in the very same time of all this going on, because the strange fact is the popes later assumed this title for themselves, which is blasphemous on several levels. Not only because it was a title for a pagan ruler who was the high priest over all religions, especially those that are pagan, but if you know your church history, the only time it ever been used for a pope was in a very sarcastic way by somebody who was an adversary of the pope in his day. Tertullian, in the 200s AD, about 160 years before the Roman emperors gave up that title, actually referred to the pope in his day, which was either Pope Calixtus I or Agrippinus of Carthage, as the Pontifex Maximus, but he didn't mean it as a compliment. He meant it as a sarcastic way of saying he acts like he's this kind of a priest over all priests. The Pope in that day was allowing a lot of people to come back to church who had been adulterers and fornicators, and he was just giving them a blanket pardon, essentially. Tertullian said, "I hear that there has even been an edict sent forth, and a peremptory one too. The Pontifex Maximus," which he meant in a sarcastic tone, that is the Bishop of Bishops, which again he meant in a sarcastic tone, issues an edict saying, "I remit to such as have discharged the requirements of repentance, the sins both of adultery and of fornication." And Tertullian said, "O edict on which cannot be inscribed good deed, far, far from Christ's betrothed be such a proclamation." So it's interesting that the popes would later use that very title that was used by Roman emperors who recognized it was a pagan title and rejected it for that reason. And the only time it was ever used of a pope is when it was being used in a sarcastic way to say he thinks of himself as this. So I just think that's an interesting sidebar of history that was going on at this same time. So let's move forward to some beliefs some have about the church going into the wilderness and the 1260 years beginning in the 400s or 500s AD. You're going to find when we get to 538 in just the next few minutes that one of the arguments the Adventists have made for why they believe it started in 538 was that a declaration was made at that time that the Pope was the supreme head of the church. But that's not quite historically accurate, as you're going to see in just a few minutes. But it's not just the dating that they're using that's inaccurate. It's also the claim that this was some momentous event that Justinian in 538 made this declaration about the Pope, which he didn't make in 538. He actually made it in 533, but nonetheless, we'll come back to that. The idea is, well, if this great declaration was made, that's the beginning of him having that level of power. Of course, they also include the defeat of the Arian Christian kingdoms at that point in time, but that also doesn't fit 538 like they claim that it does, which I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to. Let's talk about the 400s first, because there's an example in the mid 400s of the very same kind of language being used about the Pope. Why didn't they start at that point? If it's all about the language being used for the Pope, Pope Leo I was a major influencer of papal authority. One of the things that he did was attempt to arbitrate between different conflicts going on in Europe at the time. In one of his attempts to do so, the individual who he was trying to get to recognize his authority rejected his authority. And so Pope Leo appealed to the Roman emperor to support him and to effectively declare that he had this authority. The Roman emperor at that time was Valentinian III. And on June the 6th of 445 AD, Valentinian III did make a decree that recognized the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over all other bishops. It didn't just do that, which is one of the things those who hold on to 538 think happened at that time, which actually happened 5 years before that. It also authorized the governors of the Roman provinces to forcibly extradite any bishop who refused to answer a summons to Rome. Meaning if the Pope summoned a bishop anywhere in the Roman Empire to come to Rome and he refused, the governors, the civil powers of the Roman province could forcibly take him to Rome. That's a massive change in the level of authority, not just recognition of the Bishop of Rome supposedly having primacy, but also a tremendous amount of power that shows that if you don't obey the Bishop of Rome, the civil power will act against you. I want to read the exact wording of the declaration, which is pretty significant. And of course, this is the opinion of that tainted Roman emperor, and certainly not spiritually true. But he said, since then, the primacy of the apostolic see, that means the one who has the apostolic authority inherited from the apostles, is established by the merit of St. Peter, who is the chief among the bishops, by the majesty of the city of Rome, and finally by the authority of a holy council, no one without inexcusable presumption may attempt anything against the authority of that see. In other words, no one was allowed to ever question the authority of that position that the Pope was holding, because he's claiming to hold it as the inheritor of Peter, who they believe was the greatest apostle and the leader of the apostles. He goes on to say, peace will be secured among the churches if everyone recognized his ruler, referring to the Pope as the ruler over all the churches. But later he says in this decree, lest even a slight commotion should arise in the churches or the religious order be disturbed, we herewith permanently decree that not only the bishops of Gaul, but those of the other provinces shall attempt nothing counter to ancient custom without the authority of the venerable Father, which is the word Pope, by the way, in the original, of the eternal city, meaning Rome. Whatever shall be sanctioned by the authority of the apostolic see shall be law, essentially to everyone. So that if one of the bishops be summoned to the judgment of the Roman bishop and shall neglect to appear, he shall be forced by the moderator of his province to present himself. In all respects, let the privileges be maintained which our deified predecessors have conferred upon the Roman Church, which is astonishing in its statements. Our deified predecessors, that means our predecessors that are now gods. So this is lunacy from beginning to end. There's a reason, though, I'm pointing this out, because when we get to the Adventist conceptions of what happened in 538 and the decree of Justinian in 533 about how the Pope was the head of all the holy churches, that was nothing in comparison to what was said in 445. What was said in 445 was a much bigger statement with far more involved in it. Before we leave that behind, though, and move on, if you're trying to look for an end date of the 1260 years connected to 445, which would have to be 1705, there is one significant event that someone might try to tie to this time period. In 1703, just 2 years before this, is when John Wesley was born. And during this period is when the Methodist movement was established, which is the greatest precursor and motivator of the holiness movement. So if somebody wanted to try to find a connection between 445 and the 1260 years, you could get pretty close to the time of Wesley and the holiness movement. Talking about the Adventists now, I'll give them the credit that they did keep looking for a beginning point until they found something that looks like a significant event happened at the end of a 1260-year period. But I'm going to show you that their math is a little fuzzy, which moves us to our next option, which is the 538 to 1798 belief that the Adventists held that some of our elder brethren, several generations back in the beginning of our body of churches, studied and taught, and from that point forward has been held by many among us. But in order to hold on to this belief, you do have to look at actual history. And it's careful not to just study Seventh-day Adventist literature because, as I said, they skew what actually happened in history. You go to legitimate sources of historical events, you'll find out this is actually the series of what happened. In 533 AD, Emperor Justinian I referred to the Pope in one of his decretals, in one of his statements, as the head of all the holy churches. Exactly 1,260 years after 533 was the midst of the Reign of Terror that was going on in France from 1793 to 94. But there were some major waves of revival that were also occurring in the 17 and 1800s that were going on pretty close to a 1,260-year period if it began in 533. If you were trying to argue that the 1,260 years started in 533 and ended in 1793, right before 1793 is when the First Great Awakening was going on. It went on from around 1726, 1760. And during the time of 1793, the Second Great Awakening was occurring. It had started around 1787 and went on to 1825. In 1797, just 4 years from that time, if you're trying to connect the 1,260-year period, is when the Second Great Awakening spread west and reached places like the United States. It had started in Europe. That's not 538. That's 533. There's a reason they need it to be 538, because 1798, a pretty significant event, did happen. So let me jump forward in time to tell you what happened in 1798 that they think was the end of the 1,260 years. Then we'll look at their beginning point and see if their beginning point is right. In 1797 AD, Pope Pius VI became sick, and Napoleon, who wanted to bring an end to the papacy, gave orders that if the Pope died, no successor would be allowed to be elected. In other words, he was going to end the papacy, so that if Pope Pius VI died, they couldn't elect another Pope. Then in 1798, that's the key year that the Adventists think the 1,260 years ended, Napoleon's general Berthier conquered the city of Rome. They summoned Pope Pius VI and demanded that he surrender the temporal government, which, if you don't realize, the popes had been ruling over not just the church, but the papal states as well, ruling over that whole area in a civil sense. Pius VI refused, and he clung to the altar from which they dragged him. They tore the rings off his fingers. They made a formal declaration that his temporal power was abolished, and they carried him away prisoner. And the territorial possessions of the church and of the clergy were declared the national property of what amounts to Napoleon. Now, those sound like pretty significant events that might bring an end to the 1,260 years. I haven't gone into why they believe the beginning was what it was, but I'll come back to that. Those are pretty significant events, and the Adventists do focus heavily on the fact that the Pope was taken prisoner. What a major thing. That's not the first time a Pope was taken prisoner. Clement VII, in the 1500s, more than 200 years before this, got into a conflict with the Holy Roman Empire and ended up going to war with them. There's a long story to that. When they finally defeated him, he agreed to pay a ransom of 400,000 ducats in exchange for his life, as well as giving up some of the cities that were under the power of the papacy, like Parma and Medina and a couple of others, that he surrendered to the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, Venice then came in and took advantage of his weakness, and they captured several cities as well, which means a chunk of the papal states were taken from him, and he was taken prisoner. The very same kind of thing that happened when Napoleon took Pope Pius VI prisoner. So 1798 wasn't the first time something like this had happened. He was a pope that was a prisoner in Rome who lost territory long before 1798. So 1798 wasn't the first major significant example of something like that happening. Like, oh my, nothing like this has ever happened in history before. It's momentous. It wasn't momentous in terms of past history. Things like this had happened before. All kinds of lunacy happened in the papacy. Times when there were multiple popes warring with each other and assassinating each other and everything else. What happened in 1798 was nowhere near as momentous when you know all of church history as you might think. But there's another reason it's not as significant as the Adventists would like to make it. Because what happened in 1798 was temporary. It wasn't that the Pope was in prison and from that point on there were no more popes like Napoleon wanted. He didn't get what he wanted. There have been popes since. It wasn't that the papal states were taken away and they were never given back. What the Adventists often seem to ignore or strategically avoid is the fact that Napoleon's empire was defeated in 1814 and the Papal States were essentially restored back to the Roman Church. So that seizure of power in 1798 that they think is so earth-shattering and into the 1260 years only lasted 16 years before at least a measure of that power was returned. In September of 1870, Rome was captured by the armies of the King of Italy at the time, Victor Emmanuel II. And Rome and what was left of the Papal States were annexed to the Kingdom of Italy in the following October. That is when the Papal States truly came to an end. So that date's just as significant as 1798. In fact, it's more significant because what happened in 1798 only lasted 16 years. What happened in 1870 has still not ended because the only thing the papacy has now is Vatican City. They don't have the Papal States like they used to have. They tried to hold on to them in name, but by the 1920s, Pope Pius XI renounced what was left of the Papal States, stopped laying claim to them, and made the Lateran Treaty with Italy. By the way, it was ruled at that time by Benito Mussolini. And in 1929, the State of the Vatican City was created, which is all the popes have had since in terms of any civil power. So as you can see, what happened in 1798, which is the date that the Adventists taught is when the 1260 years ended, was just a blip on the radar when you consider it. The Pope was taken captive, yes. Pope had been taken captive before in history, and sometimes worse things than being taken captive. They were assassinated and other things. The Papal States were seized? Yes, the Papal States were seized, but that only lasted for 16 years, and they weren't truly taken until, as I said, about 72 years later when Rome was captured by Victor Emmanuel II's armies. So you can see how their end point is not as significant as they might want it to be. But the end point is not the worst problem for the idea that the 1260 years began in 538. The beginning point is the real problem because the beginning point simply does not match the 1260-year period. In order for them to conclude that it ends in 1798, it had to begin in 538. Their argument is that it was in 538 that the Arian Ostrogoths were driven back from their siege of Rome. And at that point, the Pope was no longer challenged by any Arian groups. The Arian Ostrogoths were Christians who believed in an Arian view of the Godhead, two in the Godhead, versus the Trinitarian view the Pope held. So part of the idea behind this is, once the Arian Ostrogoths were defeated, there was no one else who could take a stand against the Pope to keep him from rising to complete supremacy in terms of presenting his doctrine, his order, his superiority, his effectively rulership over what became the Papal States. If it were true, then in 538, all opposition to the Pope was forever ended, and he rose to a level of power no one could challenge him. Maybe 538 to 1798 would be a legitimate thing. But that's not at all what happened historically. Let me go back just a little bit in time to give you some background and tell you the history of what occurred in this time. And I pray that if any of you hold to the idea of the 1260 years being from 538 to 1798, you'll take this information, go study it on your own, and validate it, vet it, as I said. And I would hope you would come to the conclusion that that is probably not the best interpretation. In 476 AD, 62 years before 538, the last of the emperors in Rome were deposed. I mean, in the Western Roman Empire. There are still Eastern Roman emperors. If you remember your history, the Roman Empire is divided into East and West. There were emperors in Constantinople in the East and emperors in Rome in the West. The emperors in Rome in the West disappearing did open up a power vacuum for the Pope to rise to greater power. There's no doubt about that. But it was 476 when the last of those emperors in Rome were deposed, and at that time, Italy came under the control of Arian rulers, beginning with a king called Odoacer. The Adventist approach to this history is that that is the thing that kept the Pope from being able to step into that power vacuum and essentially assume the role of supreme ruler in the West. Okay. If that's true, then we should expect that he became the supreme ruler in the West without any more competition because the Arian Christians were completely defeated by 538. We're going to see that is absolutely not what happened. 493 AD, Odoacer was defeated by Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who was also an Arian Christian. Again, the argument the Adventists have made, which is the influence behind the idea that 1260 years is 538 to 1798, is that the supremacy of papal doctrine and order couldn't be complete while there were still Arian kings ruling Rome, and while the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's the supreme bishop in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, continued to be competition for the position of head of all the churches in the empire. There was all kinds of political maneuvering going on during these centuries between the Pope in the West and the Patriarch in the East to try to put themselves in the preeminent position. But the chief argument for 538 AD being the beginning of the 1260 years, it's made by Adventists because they're the origin of this teaching, is based on the assumption that both challenges to the Pope ended in 538, so he could then rule without any threat to his power. There no longer was a challenge from the Eastern Roman Empire because the emperor had declared the Pope was the head of all the churches, which he did in 533, 5 years before this, not 538, and which I demonstrated to you a few minutes ago had already been declared before this, so that's not the first time that was done. And then the other challenge that they say had to be overcome was that the Gothic tribes, the Arian tribes, had to be totally defeated, no longer a threat. So let's look at the next few years of this period and find out exactly what happened historically and if it's true that the Arian tribes were no longer a threat in 538, which would have to be the case if the Adventist belief of 538 to 1798 is true. 533 AD, I just mentioned a minute ago, the Eastern Emperor Justinian I, because of arguments that were going on about who was the supreme bishop, issued a document that recognized the bishop in Rome as the head of all the holy churches. Now, I just told you a moment ago, that's not the first time a Roman emperor issued such a document. So that isn't tremendously significant in terms of, oh, look, this is the beginning of something. That had been done 100 years before this, so it's not the first time for that. Then in 534 AD, Justinian sent an army under his general Belisarius to fight against the Arian kingdoms, and they destroyed the Vandal kingdom, which was one of the Arian groups that ruled in Carthage and controlled the Mediterranean. Then Belisarius turned toward Rome, and eventually he drove out the Ostrogoths, who were holding on to Rome, in 536 AD, not 538. But even if it were 538, that wasn't the end of the story, because in 537, the Ostrogoths came back and laid siege to Rome, and a second Roman force was sent, and they arrived, and here's where they start their date, in 538 AD, and the Ostrogoths retreated from their siege of Rome. And at that point, those who teach that Adventist interpretation stop their study of history, apparently, and say, look at that. The Ostrogoths were driven back, so it's all over now. The Pope has supreme authority, and the 1260 years begin because he no longer has any challenges to his authority. Okay, there's a major problem with that, because the retreat of the Ostrogoths in 538 by no means gave the Pope unchallenged authority, because the battle for Italy and Rome continued for some time after 538. It didn't end in 538. That was just a temporary retreat. A new Arian Ostrogoth king, Totila, captured Rome in 546, 8 years after the Adventist teaching says that the Pope no longer had anything challenging him, and he took Rome from Belisarius. Then later, Belisarius briefly, just for a short time, retook Rome, but then he got called back to Constantinople in 549 AD, and Totila again captured Rome, and didn't just capture Rome, he went on to reconquer Italy and Sicily, which means if the Pope's power began to rise and it was unchecked from 538 on, because the Ostrogoths were driven back in 538, what in the world do you do with the fact that the Ostrogoths came right back and they were in greater control in the 540s than they were in 538? I'm trying to say this as gently as I can, but a person would have to be a very poor student of history or just ignoring certain things if they believe 538 was the date when the papacy had this level of power that began the 1260 years, because that was just the middle of a long series of battles that they didn't even win. That was absolutely not the end of the challenge of the papacy in 538. And by the way, by the end of 550 AD, 12 years after 538, Totila, the Arian ruler, had recaptured all of Italy except for Ravenna and 4 coastal towns, which means that little short retreat that happened in 538 had no bearing historically at all. That was a tiny respite in the middle of this battle. It didn't have any significance in terms of ending anything because the battle continued on for years after that. The next year, Justinian sent another general, Narses, to recapture Italy, but he didn't immediately recapture it. That war went on till 562 AD, when the Byzantines finally got control of all of Italy. Which means if the Adventists were trying to be historically honest, or at least historical students, they'd start their 1260 years at 562 if their whole point is now the Pope has no one to challenge his authority, because they were continuing to challenge him in greater ways after 538 than they were before 538. So 538 wasn't the watershed moment or the tipping point by any stretch of the imagination. So the claim that 538 AD is a key chronological point when the papacy finally had control of Rome without Arian kings occupying it, which supposedly allowed the papacy and its doctrines and order to rise unchecked and unchallenged, is completely incorrect when you make a simple study of history. Forgive me, I've gotten up my bully pulpit in regard to that issue because it is so commonly quoted by ones who've studied Adventist doctrine that they don't study the history and realize those dates simply do not fit into a 1260-year period, which means, as we've been discussing, we've got to keep looking. What dates would fit into a 1260-year period? We found one potentially for a fulfillment of this by Israel, but as I've been saying, there is a 1260-year time period for the church. We're going to move on to the 6th to the 8th centuries, where there was some things going on with the papacy in the West and their attempts to get out from under what they thought was subordination to the Byzantine emperors in the Eastern Roman Empire. Pope Gregory I, who ruled from 590 to 604, is usually considered a pretty significant person in this area. He was pope during the collapse of imperial authority in northern Italy, and he stepped into that power vacuum and took over the civil administration of the cities, and even negotiated at one point for the protection of Rome with the Lombard invaders who were threatening it. Later in the 8th century, after the rise of Islam had weakened the Byzantine Empire in the east and the Lombards had renewed their attacks in Italy, the popes finally sought support from the Frankish rulers, and that's when they received the gifts, so to speak, of the papal states from the Frankish king, Pepin the Short. And then at the end of that period, you see Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. So let's look at some of the dates in that period and see if any of those fit into a 1260-year time frame. In 606 AD, Pope Boniface III received a decree from Emperor Phocas stating that he was head of all the churches. Once again, though, that is the very same kind of language that's been used several generations before this and 100 years before that. So that wouldn't be something new and momentous. Though I don't think it's a good starting point. If you did take that forward 1260 years, you'd be at 1866 AD, which is just 9 years after the beginning of the Third Great Awakening, which went on from 1857 to around 1920. And that was the beginning of the Pentecostal movement. But again, I don't think that kind of decree would be significant considering that the very same decree had been made much more forcefully and comprehensively several times before this. Some people think that the 1260 years began around 610 AD when Muhammad claimed to have his visions that would become the basis for the religion of Islam. If 610 AD was the time, that would take us out to 1870 AD, which I mentioned earlier is the time when King Victor Emmanuel II captured the Papal States under Pope Pius IX and unified the Italian peninsula. That, by the way, ended an approximately 1,116-year-long reign of the papacy over the Papal States. That went on from around 754 to 1870. Later, they were only partially restored by the Lateran Treaty I referred to in 1929 when Mussolini gave sovereign independence of the Vatican City. So someone might say that's a pretty significant date. Before we move on from the possibility of the 1260 years starting in 610 AD when Muhammad began having his visions and ending in 1870, you could maybe look at other dates in the 600s AD when Islam really began its conquests, which would then take you into the late 1800s, early 1900s when the Pentecostal movement began and the work of Brother William Sodders and other great leaders in that day was occurring. I still don't believe that is likely to be the most significant date because I don't believe the church came out of the wilderness in terms of what we think of as it being fulfilled as coming out of the wilderness in 1870. Not when you look at the things that are qualities of the church in the wilderness, and when you look at the things that would seem to have to be present when the church came out of the wilderness, especially when you look at the parallels in 1 Kings 18 and other places, as we talked about already. As far as the woman going into the wilderness in the 700s AD, and sometime in the 700s being the time that the 1260 years begin, it was in the mid-750s that Pepin made his donation. I mentioned that some believe it was 754, and then again it lasted till 1870. Some hold it to be 756. The donation of Pepin is what it's technically called. That's when he basically handed a certain territory, especially associated with Italy, to the papacy to rule over as civil rulers. If the 750s were the beginning of that, it would put us into the 2000 teens, so 2014, 15, 16. I certainly don't think the church came out of the wilderness 9 to 11 years ago. Some people think that the beginning of the 1260 years was the Second Council of Nicaea, which was in 787 AD. That's another example of a council where the Roman Church was referred to several times in writing about that council as the head of all churches. But again, that type of expression isn't significant at all unless you're going to use the very first time it was used, but you'd have to go back well into the 400s or before when that kind of expression was first used formally for the Roman Church. Some believe that this 1260 years began in 781 AD, when Charlemagne codified and expanded the papal states. If that were true, that the papal states got expanded to a certain level and thus this began, you'd have to place the end of the 1260 days around 2041 AD. That is close to 2,000 years from the time of Christ in the early church, but I don't think the beginning point is a significant enough event that it would be the beginning of the 1260 years. There aren't very many other possibilities. I've given you a couple that I think have some potential merit, but I myself presently lean towards this beginning closer to the time of 800 AD. On December 25th of 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. That may not be any more significant than anything else, other than the fact that that's the first time we know of that a pope actually crowned a Roman emperor. And if you look at all the other events of history, which would take me a long time to get into, and I want you to study on your own, that were going on in the 600s and 700s and 800s AD, from the foundation of Islam to the building of the Dome of the Rock that we talked about, to the levels of power the Roman Church rose to, that began mass persecutions against those who stood against its doctrine and order, it would fit this time period pretty well. Because, as I said a little earlier, the woman going into the wilderness seems to be directly connected to that woman fleeing into the wilderness in response to a high level of persecution by the false church. Now, you might argue the persecution being talked about regarding the devil and his angels and that war and the other things that were going on in Revelation 12 are just talking about in Jesus' day. Well, if that's true, then the 1260 years had to start back then, and we already saw that's impossible. Well, then you might say, well, no, that's what happened under the Roman Empire in the 100s or into the end of the 200s AD. Once again, unless you're tying that to the Reformation, there isn't really a good ending point that matches that. And though the Reformation sounds like a good ending point, any of the starting points you'd come to in that era don't match up with any significant date during the Reformation if you're using exactly 1260 years. And thus, as we've already done, you could move forward and see that the 1260 years just doesn't click into place in most of those areas in a way that looks like it's fulfilling everything you see happening inside the 1260 years. What I said earlier when I was talking about Israel as a potential parallel with this, there are things in those prophecies that look like they could be referencing some of the things that Israel has gone through. But there definitely are things in those prophecies that are talking about things the church has gone through. And as I'm going to say again, the 1260 days is not about the false church falling away, which is what makes it the false church, and that's the moment the 1260 days started. It's about the true church who didn't fall away, escaping what appears to be the false church that did fall away. Because as I said, you really can't argue that the latter part of the persecution described in Revelation 12 is only talking about the first century or the Roman Empire, because those dates don't match up with any good endpoint for the 1260 days where anything significant happened. If we were to place the end of the 1260 days somewhere around 800 AD, because the level of power the papacy was rising to at that time truly was unprecedented. The level of power the papacy rose to at this time in the 600s and 700s and on into the 800s was unprecedented. The same things are being said about the papacy, but it wasn't until the 700s AD that they had the papal states and could rule with civil authority, and it wasn't until 800 AD that they were crowning kings, and you'll see other things happen in this historical period that are very significant examples of the kind of dictatorial power the papacy had. So if we were to take the date of around 800 AD and try to go forward 1260, it would take us to about 2060, 2070, somewhere in that range. Close to 2,000 years from the time of the period of judgment that fell on Israel in the first century that was associated with the Jewish-Roman War that started in the 2060s and ended at Masada in 73 AD and came to its peak in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which also is interesting because if the 1260 days were to come to an end, and I am not claiming it's going to, I'm giving you one more theory, which is a theory that I am seriously considering. If it were to come to an end in the 2060s, that would leave anywhere from 3 to 10 years, given the fact that our calendar is off some, before the 2,000-year anniversary of the beginning of that judgment on Israel that occurred with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which could possibly give a time period of the restoration of the church prior to the end of the period of Israel's judgment. When I said that I think a 2,000-year anniversary is significant related to the restoration of the church and the restoration of Israel for that matter, I have good reason for that. We have this powerful prophecy in the 6th chapter of Hosea that begins, "Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up." This is Israel talking about returning to God. They've been cut off from relationship with God by their rejection of Christ. And notice what it says. "After 2 days will he revive us. In the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight." If those 2 days are 1,000-year prophetic days, which I think they have to be, there isn't any other 2-day period that would apply to this. That could be referring to the fact that God tore and smote Israel, and after 2 days he'll heal them, bind them up, and revive them. Again, if that 2 days represents 2,000 years, and if his tearing them and smiting them was fulfilled in 70 AD, which I believe to be the case, you would have to conclude that somewhere in the neighborhood of 2070 AD, give or take a few years based on differences in the calendar, or given whether or not we're talking about a lunar or a solar calendar, would be very close to the dates that I'm talking about. So, as I said in the beginning, I think the best we can do with the 1260 days is to have biblical, rational, and historical theories about when they might have started. Could the 1260 years have started in the 300s AD with some of the events that happened there and came to their close in the 1500s during the Reformation? Possibly. Though, again, if we look at the parallels in Elijah's story in 1 Kings 18, it doesn't look like that's happened unless you think it's going to happen sometime after that time is over. But here's the problem with trying to stretch things out and saying, well, the church came out of the wilderness in the 1500s, and ever since then, the church has been in a process of restoration that'll finally get us to the events that we see when the cloud rises out of the sea, the ministry is restored, all those things we talked about in one of our past sessions. But that isn't how the story is described. It's not the 3.5-year period ends and these things happen sometime later. No, these things happen as the ending of the 3.5-year period, the 1260 days, or prophetically 1260 years. Which means if we're going to take Elijah's story, which we always have, as a parallel with this, there isn't an end to the 1260 days until that cloud like a man's hand comes up out of the sea, and until the abundance of rain, not just a water source, but the abundance of rain comes. And we have taught, and I continue to believe, the cloud coming up out of the sea, shaped like a man's hand, is a picture of the 5 offices of ministry being restored. I certainly do not think they were restored in any kind of full sense in the 1500s. And their restoration is the prelude of the church coming out of the wilderness. The 1260-day period, just like the 3.5-year period in Elijah's day, doesn't end until after the cloud rises out of the sea. The cloud rises out of the sea, and then the rain comes. The 1260-day period, the 3.5-year period in Elijah's day, was a period where there was no rain. which means you can't argue the wilderness period of the church has ended until the cloud rises up out of the sea and there is that level of rain that we believe is represented by an abundance of rain, which may be a greater outpouring of the Holy Spirit than we have experienced even to this day. Perhaps you might argue it started in the 300s AD and ended in the 1500s, but as I said earlier, the 300s AD was not a time when the false church was persecuting the true church in any mass sense. There were battles going back and forth, but not at the scale we seem to see in Revelation 12. But even if that were the case, even if you could argue that were the case, you'd have to conclude that all the things I just described in some of the previous classes and what I just said about Elijah would have had to have come to a conclusion in the 1500s AD. And now for the last almost 500 years, we have been living outside of the wilderness with a fully functioning fivefold ministry and with the abundance of rain having already begun to fall, when history simply does not attest to that kind of an idea. So again, we go to some other dates. You could go to the 600s and look into the 1800s and maybe the great revivals that occurred then and the elements that were a prelude of the Pentecostal movement. Perhaps. But again, you do have to fit all the things that have to occur inside the 1260 days inside the time you think they occurred. So if it ended in the late 1800s, early 1900s, then we should expect to see everything fulfilled that you see in those passages, that it's behind us now, and we should expect to see everything that those passages promise is coming, such as the fivefold ministry and the abundance of rain we see in the end of 1 Kings 18, in our past. It's already been fulfilled some time ago. And I'm not sure I can make that case, which is why I heavily lean towards an idea that we're still in the wilderness and we are approaching its end, perhaps in the very generation that we're living in or in the generation following right after us. I don't want to set a date. It sounds like I've done it. That's not my intent. I'm just trying to be as general as possible. That's why I didn't go into a whole lot of detailed descriptions of what was going on in the 700s and 800s, nor in our day, because the more detailed I get, the more specific dates will start to appear, and I'm trying to avoid saying a specific date. But my present feeling is that that would be the general time period.